January 17th, 1945. The Ardennes Forest, 0347 hours. The snow had stopped falling an hour before midnight, leaving the Belgian countryside wrapped in a silence so complete it felt unnatural. The kind of silence that presses against the eardrums. Major Friedrich Weber of the 12th SS Panzer Division stood in a farmhouse doorway, his breath forming white clouds in the frozen air, watching the eastern horizon with the weary patience of a man who had learned to read the language of war. The temperature had dropped to -15°C. Frost clung to the bare branches of shattered trees like skeletal fingers reaching toward a sky the color of gunmetal. In the distance, perhaps 3 kilometers away, the ruins of what had once been the village of Foy sat dark and silent against the snow-covered hills. He had taken off his gloves to light a cigarette, his last one, and the match flame seemed impossibly bright in the darkness, a small defiance against the cold that had seeped into his bones over the past 32 days. His hands trembled, though whether from the cold or exhaustion he could no longer tell. The division had been retreating for 11 days straight, falling back through the same forests and villages they had captured with such confidence just weeks before during the opening days of Operation Wacht am Rhein, what the Americans called the Battle of the Bulge, the great offensive that was meant to split the Allied armies, recapture Antwerp, and turn the tide of the war had collapsed like a house built on sand. Weber drew the smoke deep into his lungs and closed his eyes for just a moment. Behind him, in the farmhouse cellar, 16 of his men slept in shifts, pressed together for warmth like animals in a den. Most were boys, conscripts pulled from their homes in the final desperate levies of 1944, thrust into uniforms that didn't fit and handed rifles many had never fired. The veterans, those who had survived France, Russia, Normandy, could be counted on one hand. Their faces had the 1,000-yard stare that needed no explanation, the haunted look of men who had seen too much death and knew with absolute certainty that more was coming. He opened his eyes and studied the horizon again. Nothing. Just darkness and the faint outline of hills against the pre-dawn sky. But he knew they were out there. The Americans. He could feel them in the same way a sailor feels an approaching storm, that prickling sensation at the base of the skull that speaks of danger just beyond sight. For 3 days, his unit had been falling back toward the German border, harassed by American reconnaissance patrols, strafed by fighter bombers whenever the weather cleared enough for them to fly. They had abandoned their vehicles 2 days ago when the fuel ran out, leaving behind half-tracks and trucks on frozen roads, stripping them of ammunition and anything useful before setting them ablaze. Now they moved on foot, carrying what they could, leaving behind what they couldn't. The cigarette burned down to his fingers. He dropped it into the snow where it hissed and died. 4 more hours until dawn. If they could reach the next rally point before daylight, they might. The horizon flickered. Just once. A brief pulse of light, there and gone so quickly he thought perhaps he had imagined it. Weber's breath caught in his throat. He stared at the spot unblinking, counting seconds in his head. 1, 2, 3, 4. The sky erupted. Not in one place, but everywhere at once, as if the sun had decided to rise from a dozen different points on the compass simultaneously. The eastern horizon transformed into a wall of light, brilliant and terrible, bright enough to cast sharp shadows on the snow at his feet. The farmhouse, the trees, the hills, everything leapt into stark relief, rendered in blacks and whites like a photograph. For one impossible heartbeat, night became day. Then the sound arrived. Not a single explosion, but a continuous rolling thunder that started as a low rumble and built into a physical force that shook the ground beneath his boots. The windows of the farmhouse rattled in their frames. Frost fell from the trees in crystalline showers. Inside the cellar, men jolted awake with shouts of alarm. The sound didn't stop. It grew, swelling into a roar that seemed to come from the earth itself, a sustained apocalyptic crescendo that made rational thought impossible. Weber stood frozen in the doorway, transfixed by the sight. The flashes continued, hundreds of them, winking along the horizon like malevolent stars, each one marking the position of an American artillery piece, hurling high explosive death toward German positions. He had been on the Eastern Front. He had experienced Soviet artillery barrages at Kursk, had cowered in trenches while Katyusha rockets screamed overhead and the earth heaved and buckled like a living thing. But this was different. The Russian barrages had been savage, brutal, overwhelming in their sheer volume of fire. This was precise, coordinated, methodical. The timing between salvos remained constant, each battery firing in perfect sequence, the shells whistling overhead with a sound like express trains tearing through the sky. Sergeant Klaus Hoffmann appeared at Weber's elbow, his face pale in the unnatural light. "Mein Gott," he whispered. "How many guns?" Weber didn't answer. He was counting the flashes, trying to estimate the number of batteries, calculating rates of fire in his head with the cold mathematics of a professional soldier. 20, 30, 40 separate muzzle flashes visible from this position alone, which meant the actual number was easily double or triple that figure, spread along a front of perhaps 15 kilometers. American doctrine called for a battalion of artillery to support each infantry division, 18 guns. 3 divisions would mean 54 guns. But this was corps-level fire, army level, hundreds of guns firing simultaneously, coordinated by radio and telephone, guided by forward observers and spotter aircraft, delivering shells with industrial efficiency. "Where are they targeting?" Hoffmann asked, his voice barely audible over the continuous roar. Weber pointed toward the southeast, where the flashes seemed concentrated. "Hufeleis, the crossroads. They're cutting off the retreat route." The realization settled over both men like a physical weight. Hufeleis sat at the junction of 5 roads, the only practical route for German forces trying to pull back across the Ahr River into Germany. If the Americans had that crossroads under sustained artillery fire, every unit trying to retreat through the area would be trapped in a killing zone, forced to choose between advancing into the bombardment or staying in place to be surrounded and destroyed by advancing American infantry. The barrage continued without pause. 1 minute, 2, 5, 10. The shells screamed overhead in an endless stream, their passage making the air itself vibrate. Impact explosions bloomed in the distance, orange flowers of fire sprouting among the hills, entire hillsides disappearing in fountains of earth and snow. Trees that had stood for a century were uprooted and flung aside like matchsticks. Buildings simply ceased to exist, vaporized by the concentration of high explosive. The snow itself seemed to catch fire, the thermal effects of the explosions turning the frozen landscape into a hellscape of flame and steam. 15 minutes, 20. The barrage showed no sign of diminishing. Weber's initial shock had given way to a cold, calculating dread. This wasn't harassing fire. This wasn't a preliminary bombardment before an assault. This was destruction for the sake of destruction, the application of overwhelming force not to achieve a specific tactical objective but to simply eradicate everything in a designated area. The Americans weren't trying to capture ground. They were erasing it from the map. Hoffmann leaned close to Weber's ear, shouting to be heard over the thunder. "We need to move. If they adjust fire toward our position, we move at first light." Weber cut him off. "Not before. In this chaos, we'd be slaughtered by our own people, shot as deserters or partisans. We wait." But even as he said it, he knew the wait would be agony. To stand here, helpless, watching this demonstration of power, knowing that at any moment those shells could begin landing on their position instead, it required every ounce of discipline he possessed. Around him, his men had emerged from the cellar, drawn by the spectacle despite the danger. They stood in small groups, faces turned toward the light show on the horizon, speaking in hushed tones or not speaking at all, simply watching with expressions that ranged from shock to despair. Weber had joined the Wehrmacht in 1936, a young man of 20 convinced of Germany's greatness, certain that the National Socialist Revolution would restore the fatherland to its rightful place among nations. He had believed in the superiority of German arms, German training, German fighting spirit. In Poland, that belief had been confirmed. The swift victory over France had seemed to prove it beyond doubt. Even in Russia, during those first terrible winters, the conviction had held they were losing because of weather, logistics, the vastness of the enemy's resources, but not because German soldiers were inferior. Never that. But this shattered something fundamental in that belief structure. This wasn't about individual courage or tactical skill or fighting spirit. This was about industrial capacity, about an enemy that could afford to expend more ammunition in 20 minutes than Weber's entire division had fired in the past month. About a nation so wealthy, so productive, that it could ship millions of artillery shells across an ocean, through submarine-infested waters, and dump them on German positions with casual abundance, as if the cost meant nothing at all. The barrage reached 30 minutes, then 40. The sound had become part of the environment, a constant roar that numbed the mind and made ordinary thought difficult. Weber found himself thinking about a conversation he'd had 3 months ago, before the offensive began, with Oberst Heinrich Müller, a staff officer at division headquarters. Müller had spent time as a military attaché in Washington before the war, had traveled across the United States, seen the factories and farms and cities. Over schnapps one cold November evening, Müller had tried to explain what he'd witnessed. "You have to understand," Müller had said, his voice heavy with something that might have been fear or awe or both. "America is not like Europe. The scale is different. Everything is bigger. In Detroit, I toured a factory that produced more automobiles in a single day than all of Germany produces in a week. A single factory. And they have dozens of them, hundreds. The workers arrive in their own cars. Assembly line workers, Friedrich, men who bolt parts together for a living. They own automobiles. They eat meat every day. White bread. Their homes have electric refrigerators, washing machines, radios in every room. And this is normal for them. This is poverty by their standards." Weber had laughed at the time, certain Müller was exaggerating, engaging in the kind of defeatist talk that had become common among certain officers who had lost faith in final victory. But Müller had fixed him with a serious stare and continued, "We have been told that America is soft, that their soldiers are pampered boys who will break at the first taste of real combat, that their Jews and Negroes and mongrel populations make them weak. This is a lie, Friedrich, a dangerous lie. Their soldiers may lack our training, but they have something more important. They have the support of the largest industrial economy in human history. For every tank we destroy, they build 10 more. For every plane we shoot down, 20 roll off the production lines. They fight with full bellies and warm boots and unlimited ammunition. They advance not because their soldiers are supermen, but because they can afford to replace losses that would cripple us. Do you understand what I'm saying? We are fighting a war of attrition against an enemy that can afford to lose. We cannot." At the time, Weber had dismissed the warning as pessimism. Now, watching the continued bombardment, feeling it in his bones, he understood. This barrage represented more than military tactics. It represented capacity, resources, a fundamental difference in how the two sides fought the war. German artillery doctrine emphasized precision, careful rationing of shells because each one was precious and difficult to replace. American doctrine, apparently, emphasized the opposite. Overwhelming volume, concentration of fire so intense that precision became unnecessary. Why aim carefully when you could simply obliterate everything in a square kilometer? At 50 minutes, the barrage began to shift. The wall of fire that had been concentrated around Hufvudstaden started to walk northward, the impact zone creeping in their direction like a living thing. Weber felt his stomach tighten. They were adjusting fire, expanding the zone of destruction, ensuring that no German unit could escape the trap by skirting around the edges. Mathematical, systematic, thorough. "Get the men ready to move," he told Hoffman. "We leave in 10 minutes, dawn or no dawn. If that barrage reaches us, we're dead." Hoffman nodded and disappeared into the farmhouse, barking orders. The men scrambled to gather their equipment, rifles, ammunition pouches, blankets, what little food remained. Weber allowed himself one last look at the horizon. The barrage had been continuous now for nearly an hour, hundreds of shells per minute impacting across a front that must span 20 kilometers or more. The mathematics were staggering. At a conservative estimate, The Americans were expending 50,000 shells in this single bombardment. 50,000, each one weighing 15 to 30 kilograms, each one transported by ship across the Atlantic, moved by truck from the ports to ammunition dumps, then to the guns themselves. The logistics alone boggled the mind. And this was just one barrage in one sector on one night. How many others were happening at this very moment along the entire Western Front? How many millions of shells did the Americans have stockpiled, ready to fire? The answer was as obvious as it was terrifying. Enough. More than enough. An effectively limitless supply produced by factories that operated 24 hours a day, fed by farms so productive they could feed their own population and still have surplus to ship abroad, powered by oil fields that gushed petroleum with such abundance that American soldiers sometimes used gasoline to start campfires rather than conserve it. The men assembled in a ragged column, faces drawn and haggard in the flickering light. Weber did a quick count. 16 present. They had started the offensive with 43. Some were dead. Most were simply missing, scattered during the retreat, perhaps captured or deserted or lying wounded in some aid station behind the lines. These 16 were all that remained: a sergeant, 2 corporals, 13 privates, boys and broken men. "We head northwest," Weber told them, having to shout to be heard over the bombardment. "Away from Houffalize. The Americans will expect retreating units to use the roads. We go cross-country, through the forest. No fires, no stopping. We march until we reach German lines or drop. Understood?" They nodded, too exhausted to speak. Weber took one last look at the farmhouse. It had been shelter for a night, warmth of a sort, a brief respite from the cold and fear. Then he turned his back on it and began walking into the darkness, away from the light show on the horizon, his men falling into line behind him like ghosts. They marched through snow that came up to their knees in places, following game trails and fire breaks, navigating by compass and instinct. Behind them, the barrage continued, a constant thunder that pursued them like the footsteps of an angry god. The sound didn't fade. If anything, it seemed to grow louder, more guns joining the symphony of destruction, the Americans feeding more and more firepower into the bombardment. An hour into the march, they crossed a ridgeline, and Weber paused to look back. The entire southern horizon was aflame now, a continuous band of light that stretched as far as the eye could see in both directions. Dozens of square kilometers of forest and farmland being systematically destroyed, turned into a moonscape of craters and shattered trees and burning debris. And above it all, the shells continued to arc through the sky, visible as faint streaks against the darkness, hundreds of them in the air at any given moment, a steel rain that never stopped falling. Private Hans Kessler, a boy of 17 who had been conscripted 3 months ago from a farm in Bavaria, stumbled up beside Weber and followed his gaze. "Sir," he said, his voice small and lost, "how can they have so many shells?" It was the question that had been haunting Weber all night. How? But the answer was simple, even if accepting it was difficult. They had so many shells because they could, because American industry produced steel by the millions of tons, because American farms grew wheat and corn and soybeans in such abundance that they exported food to the Soviets even while feeding their own military, because American oil fields pumped petroleum with such profligacy that they powered not just tanks and planes but entire fleets of civilian automobiles, because every aspect of American society was geared toward abundance rather than scarcity, toward expansion rather than conservation. Germany fought with the resources of Central Europe, coal and iron from the Ruhr, oil from Ploesti until the refineries were bombed, grain from Ukraine until the Soviets drove them out. America fought with the resources of an entire continent, oil from Texas and Oklahoma and California, steel from Pittsburgh and Gary, wheat from Kansas, corn from Iowa, timber from the Pacific Northwest, copper from Montana, rubber from factories that synthesized it when the natural supplies were cut off. The scales were not just unbalanced, they were incomparable. "They have so many shells," Weber said quietly, "because they are rich, Kessler. richer than we ever imagined possible, and they are spending that wealth to bury us. They resumed marching. Dawn came slowly, reluctantly, the sky lightening by degrees from black to gray to a pale, washed-out blue. The barrage continued without pause. When full daylight arrived around 800 hours, Weber climbed a small rise and used his binoculars to study the area where Houffalize had been. Smoke rose in thick columns, so dense it formed its own weather system, an artificial thundercloud hanging over the landscape. Through gaps in the smoke, he caught glimpses of what the artillery had wrought. Entire hillsides stripped bare of vegetation, roads that had ceased to exist, villages reduced to foundations and scattered bricks. Nothing moved. Nothing lived. It was as if a giant hand had reached down and simply erased everything human from the landscape, leaving only raw earth behind. By midday, they had covered perhaps 8 kilometers, moving slowly through the deep snow, exhausting themselves with each step. The barrage had finally stopped sometime around 1000 hours, the sudden silence almost as shocking as the initial outbreak of fire. But the damage was done. Weber knew without needing to be told that any German units caught in that zone were gone. Casualties, not of battle, but of industrial slaughter, killed not by enemy soldiers, but by anonymous gunners firing from positions kilometers away. Men who would never see the faces of those they killed, who would simply load and fire and load and fire until the orders came to stop. They found an abandoned hunting cabin around 1400 hours and stopped to rest. The men collapsed immediately, too tired to post proper sentries, trusting to luck and isolation to protect them. Weber sat with his back against the cabin wall, closed his eyes, and allowed himself to think clearly for the first time since the barrage began. The Ardennes offensive had failed. That much was clear now, if it hadn't been before. The Americans had recovered from the initial shock, brought up reinforcements, and were now pushing back with methodical ferocity. And if they could mount artillery barrages of the scale he had witnessed last night, if that level of firepower was standard rather than exceptional, then the war was already lost. Not might be lost, was lost. The mathematics were brutal and unarguable. You could not defeat an enemy who could afford to expend ammunition with such abandon, who could replace losses faster than you could inflict them, who could feed and clothe and equip millions of soldiers while simultaneously maintaining civilian living standards that made German citizens look like paupers. He thought of his wife, Anna, back in Stuttgart with their 2 daughters. She wrote to him every week, cheerful letters that tried to hide the reality of life on the home front, the rations that grew smaller each month, the neighborhoods destroyed by British bombing raids, the constant fear of the air raid sirens. She never complained. She wrote about the girls' schoolwork, about her volunteer shifts at the hospital, about neighbors and small triumphs in everyday life. But he could read between the lines. Germany was starving. Germany was dying. Germany was losing. And yet, the propaganda continued to promise final victory. Wonder weapons that would turn the tide. New divisions being formed. The enemy's will breaking. Lies, all of it. Lies told by men who were either deluded or cynical, who sent boys like Kessler to die in forests and fields because they could not admit the truth, that Germany had picked a fight with enemies who outmatched them in every material category, and that ideology and fighting spirit could not overcome industrial reality. Weber opened his eyes and looked at his sleeping men. Most would be dead within weeks. The statistical probability was overwhelming. As the Allies pushed into Germany itself, the fighting would grow more desperate, more vicious. Towns and cities would become battlefields. Civilians would be caught in the crossfire. And for what? To delay the inevitable, to allow the leadership a few more weeks or months of power before the final collapse. He had believed once. That was the terrible thing. He had truly believed in the cause, in the righteousness of Germany's struggle, in the necessity of defeating the enemies who surrounded them. But belief could not survive contact with reality indefinitely, and the reality was spelled out in the mathematics of that artillery barrage. Shells, shells, and more shells. An endless supply that spoke of resources so vast they made German resistance seem not heroic but futile. They rested for 2 hours, then pushed on as afternoon faded toward evening. Weber navigated by compass and memory, aiming for a sector of the front he knew had been relatively quiet, hoping to slip through the lines in darkness and rejoin what remained of the division. If the division still existed, if there were lines to slip through, if the Americans hadn't already advanced beyond the positions he remembered. Around 1800 hours, they heard voices, German voices, thank God, and came upon a defensive position manned by a company of Volksgrenadiers, old men and teenagers pressed into service in the war's final desperate months. The company commander, a Hauptmann with a haunted expression and an empty sleeve where his left arm had been, listened to Weber's report with the weary resignation of a man beyond surprise. "You're the third unit to come through today," the Hauptmann said. "Everyone's retreating. The Americans have 4 divisions pushing this sector. 4, and they're supported by so much artillery we can't even get forward observers close enough to call in counter-battery fire. They just sit back and pound us into pace, then walk forward and occupy the ruins." "Last night," Weber said, "around Hufalies, we saw the barrage." The Hauptmann nodded. "Corps-level time-on-target fire mission. 27 battalions firing simultaneously. We've been told to expect more of the same. American artillery doctrine now is to simply saturate areas before any advance. They're not even trying to conserve ammunition. Why should they? They have more shells than they know what to do with." "How do we fight that?" Weber asked, though he already knew the answer. "We don't," the Hauptmann replied. "We die. We retreat. We die again. And eventually, there will be no one left to retreat, and then it ends. That's the plan, apparently. Bleed them for every meter of German soil. Make them pay, as if that matters. As if the Americans care about casualties when they can replace every dead soldier within a week." They stayed with the Volksgrenadier Company overnight, sharing what little food they had, trading stories and rumors. The old men spoke of fighting in the First World War, of trenches and gas attacks and battles that lasted months. The teenagers spoke hardly at all, their eyes holding that strange mixture of innocence and trauma that came from being thrust into adult horror before they'd had a chance to be children. Around midnight, an American artillery barrage began again, this time targeting a position 2 kilometers south. It was smaller than the previous night's bombardment, only a few batteries rather than hundreds, but it lasted for over an hour, the sound carrying clearly through the cold air. Weber and the Hauptmann sat outside the bunker entrance, smoking cigarettes, listening to the distant thunder. "You know what the Americans call it?" the Hauptmann said. "Their artillery. They call it the king of battle. Not a queen, not a prince. The king. The most important weapon on the battlefield, and they've built their entire doctrine around it. Infantry exists to locate enemy positions. Artillery exists to destroy them. Armor exploits the gaps, simple, effective, and backed by so much industrial capacity that they can sustain that doctrine indefinitely. We called tanks the breakthrough weapon," Weber said, "the spearhead of the attack." "Tanks are expensive," the Hauptmann replied. "Artillery shells are cheap. At least they're cheap if you have the industrial base to produce them by the millions, which we don't, which we never did, really. We had quality. They have quantity. Turns out quantity has a quality all its own, as Stalin supposedly said. Though I doubt he said it while sitting in a bunker being shelled by American guns." They smoked in silence for a while, watching the flashes on the horizon. Weber found himself thinking about the symbolic nature of what he was witnessing. Artillery shells, simple tubes of metal filled with explosive, accelerated by chemical propellant, guided by nothing but mathematics and gravity. The most basic form of industrial warfare, and yet also the most effective. No fancy technology required, no jet engines or rockets or radar, just steel and explosive, produced in vast quantities by the unglamorous machinery of mines and foundries and munitions plants. It was a perfect metaphor for American power, really. Not elegant, not sophisticated, just overwhelming. The brute application of resources so abundant, they seemed limitless. A nation that could afford to waste, to overkill, to expend 10 shells where one might suffice simply because having 10 shells was no inconvenience. Abundance as weapon, wealth as armor. "Do you think our commanders understand?" Weber asked. "Really understand what we're facing?" The Hauptmann shrugged. "Some do. Most don't want to admit it. Easier to blame the soldiers for not fighting hard enough, to demand more sacrifice, more willpower, as if willpower could stop high explosive, as if believing hard enough in victory could somehow conjure up the factories and oil fields and resources we don't have. He flicked his cigarette butt into the snow. We're going to lose this war, Major. You know it. I know it. Most of the men know it, even if they won't say it out loud. The only question now is how many of us die before the end comes. Then why keep fighting? What choice do we have? Desert and get shot by the SS? Surrender and spend years in a prison camp? At least this way, we go down fighting. Maybe that matters to someone. Maybe it doesn't. I don't know anymore. Weber left at dawn with his men, pushing northwest toward what he hoped were German positions. They walked through a landscape transformed by war, forests reduced to fields of splintered stumps, villages that existed only as names on maps and scatters of rubble, roads cratered and impassable, and everywhere, the smell of high explosive, that sharp chemical stink that clung to everything, that marked the landscape like a brand. They reached German lines 3 days later, or what passed for German lines in the chaos of the retreat. Weber reported to a harried staff officer who barely glanced at his papers before assigning him and his men to a scratch unit being formed from stragglers and survivors. Within a week, they were back in combat, defending a nameless ridge against an American advance. The artillery barrages had become routine by then, expected before every American attack. 20 minutes of hell, then silence, then the infantry coming forward through the smoke. Weber survived that battle, and the next, and the one after that. He survived through a combination of luck and experience, and the simple fact that death, though constant, was not universal. But each battle eroded something inside him, wore away at whatever remained of the convictions he'd once held. He watched boys die, men die, positions carefully prepared and then obliterated in minutes by American firepower. He watched the slow disintegration of what had once been the Wehrmacht, the best-trained military force in Europe, reduced to poorly armed defenders fighting with obsolete weapons and dwindling ammunition. And always, the artillery. The shells that came in the darkness and the daylight, that fell on roads and forests and towns, that killed without discrimination or mercy. The Americans had infinite shells, or might as well have had. The thunder of their guns became the background noise of existence, as constant as weather, as inescapable as gravity. In March, during the fighting for the Rhine crossings, Weber finally saw American supply dumps with his own eyes. His unit had briefly recaptured a village the Americans had used as a logistics hub, and before they were forced to retreat again, he walked through the abandoned depot and felt his understanding of the war crystallize into something hard and final. Stacks of supplies that stretched for hundreds of meters, crates of ammunition, drums of fuel, pallets of rations, all marked with English labels, all neatly organized and inventoried. And this was just one small depot for one American division in one sector of the front. Multiply it by the dozens of divisions, the hundreds of kilometers of frontage, the months of sustained combat, and the mathematics became almost incomprehensible. There were crates of cigarettes, American cigarettes, not the harsh tobacco German soldiers smoked, but smooth, factory-made products packaged in colorful paper. There were tins of food labeled with words like beef stew and fruit cocktail and chocolate pudding, rations that seemed designed not just to sustain life, but to provide comfort, pleasure, variety. There were boots, hundreds of pairs of boots, all new, all the same size, warehoused, simply because American logistics could afford to maintain inventory at the front lines. There were medical supplies in quantities that seemed obscene, bandages and sulfa drugs and morphine, enough to treat an entire regiment's casualties several times over. Weber stood in that depot and felt something break inside him, some final resistance to the truth he'd been avoiding. This was what American abundance looked like. This was what they were fighting against, not just soldiers, but an economic system that produced goods with such efficiency and scale that waste was built into the equation. The Americans could afford to stockpile. They could afford redundancy. They could afford to have supplies sitting unused in depots because running out was simply unacceptable. By contrast, German supplies arrived irregularly, rationed carefully, distributed with an eye toward conserving every last round and bandage. Weber's men wore boots until they fell apart, then wrapped their feet in rags and kept marching. They counted their rifle ammunition in single rounds rather than cases. They scavenged food from destroyed towns because rations didn't arrive on schedule. And this careful hoarding, this poverty of resources, was supposed to compete with American abundance. It was like expecting a man with a knife to defeat an opponent with a machine gun by virtue of superior willpower. The war ended in May, though for Weber it ended earlier, during a confused battle for a crossroads in Bavaria where American tanks appeared from 3 directions at once, and his unit simply disintegrated, men throwing down their weapons and walking forward with hands raised, too tired and hungry and defeated to continue the fiction of resistance. Weber surrendered to a young American lieutenant who looked impossibly clean and well-fed, whose uniform fit properly, whose equipment was all new and standardized and obviously produced by the millions in factories that had never been bombed. The prisoner of war camp was better supplied than many German military units. The food, though simple, was regular and sufficient. There were medical facilities, guards who followed rules rather than whims. Weber spent his time in the camp writing, trying to process what he'd experienced, trying to understand how the nation he'd believed in had been so thoroughly defeated. And always, he came back to that night in January, to the moment when the horizon lit up like day, and he understood, perhaps for the first time, the true nature of the enemy they'd been fighting. He wrote about it in letters to Anna, trying to explain what he'd seen. It was not that the American soldiers were supermen, he wrote. They were not. Many were poorly trained. Some were cowards. But it did not matter. They had behind them a nation so wealthy that it could afford to arm them with unlimited ammunition and feed them like princes. They did not fight because they were brave, though some were. They fought because they could afford to, because losing 10 men was an inconvenience rather than a catastrophe, because every dead tank would be replaced within a week, because their factories never stopped running, their farms never stopped producing, their oil fields never ran dry. We were told America was decadent, weak, divided by its mongrel races and Jewish influences. This was a lie. America was strong precisely because of its diversity, because it had harnessed the talents of people from everywhere on earth. Strong because it had built an economic system that produced abundance rather than scarcity. Strong because it valued efficiency and innovation over ideology and tradition. And we who prided ourselves on our discipline and fighting spirit and cultural superiority, we were crushed not by their ideology but by their factories, buried under shells produced by the millions, defeated by an enemy that could afford to waste resources we would have treasured. The artillery barrage I witnessed in January was not just a military action. It was a message, though I did not understand it at the time. The message was simple. We can afford to do this. We can afford to expend more shells in one night than your entire army has in a month. We can afford to destroy everything in a square kilometer simply because it is convenient to do so. We can afford to fight this way indefinitely. Can you? And the answer, of course, was no. We could not. We never could. The war was lost the moment it began, decided not by battles, but by factories, by economic capacity, by the simple fact that our enemies could produce more of everything than we could destroy. All the courage and skill and sacrifice of German soldiers, and there was courage, Anna, and skill, and sacrifice beyond measure. All of it was meaningless against that fundamental imbalance of resources. We fought not because we could win, but because we could not admit we had already lost. Years after the war, in the historical accounts and memoirs that tried to make sense of the conflict, German commanders returned again and again to the question of American artillery. General der Artillerie Walter Nering, in his post-war interrogation, described it as a qualitative and quantitative surprise of the first order. General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, who commanded the Panzer Lehr Division, stated that American artillery fire was the most impressive demonstration of industrial power I witnessed during the war. Even Heinz Guderian, the father of German armored doctrine, admitted that the Americans had solved the problem of concentrating fire with a speed and volume that exceeded anything we had anticipated. But perhaps the most telling comment came from an unnamed German major interviewed in a POW camp in France who said simply, "They turned night into day, not metaphorically, literally. The muzzle flashes were so constant, so numerous that you could read a map at 3 in the morning, and we understood then, really understood, what we were fighting. Not an army, an economy, and economies cannot be defeated by soldiers, no matter how brave." The symbolism of that moment, the night turned to day by American guns, lingered in German military consciousness long after the war ended. It appeared in memoirs and histories, in interviews and private letters. For those who witnessed it, the image became shorthand for everything the war had taught them about power and resources and the limits of willpower. The Germans had entered the war believing that discipline and training and fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantages. They had been wrong. The proof was there in every shell that fell, in every barrage that lit the sky, in every American advance supported by artillery concentrations that turned defense into massacre. The shells themselves became a kind of symbol, simple, crude, unsubtle instruments of destruction that nonetheless embodied the essence of American power. Each shell represented steel from Pennsylvania, explosive from Louisiana, copper from Montana, transported on ships built in Newport News, moved by trucks assembled in Detroit, delivered by soldiers fed on wheat from Kansas and beef from Texas. Each shell was a product of continent-spanning industry, of economic systems that prioritized production over elegance, quantity over quality, abundance over conservation. And the sound, that rolling thunder that continued for hours without pause, that shook the ground and rattled teeth and made thought impossible. That sound was the voice of modernity itself, of industrial civilization at full throttle, of what happened when a nation directed its entire productive capacity toward a single goal. It was not the sound of soldiers fighting, but of factories working, of coal being burned and steel being forged and propellant being mixed and packaged and shipped and expended with a prodigacy that seemed almost wasteful, except that the waste was the point. To have so much that you could afford to waste it, that was power, that was victory. For the German soldiers who experienced it, for the commanders who tried to organize defenses against it, for the men who huddled in bunkers and cellars and foxholes while the earth heaved and the air filled with steel fragments and the darkness became bright as noon. For all of them, American artillery became the defining experience of the war's final months. Not individual battles, not tactical victories or defeats, just the endless grinding application of firepower, the systematic destruction of German defensive positions by an enemy that could afford to expend ammunition on a scale that made defense impossible and retreat the only rational response. They had fought, those German soldiers. Many had fought with great courage and skill, had held positions longer than should have been possible, had inflicted casualties on their enemies out of all proportion to their numbers. But courage could not stop shells, skill could not make absent supplies appear, and in the end, all the fighting spirit in the world could not overcome the simple fact that the Americans had more guns, more shells, more trucks, more fuel, more food, more everything, and were willing to use it all to expend it with a casualness that spoke of resources so vast they seemed unlimited. The night turned to day. That was what the German commanders remembered, what they told their interrogators and historians and fellow survivors. The moment when the horizon erupted in light, when the shells began to fall, when the sound of American guns announced not just an attack, but a verdict that Germany had lost, was losing, would continue to lose until the end came. Because the mathematics were irrefutable and the scales would not balance, and no amount of belief or sacrifice or determination could alter the fundamental imbalance of resources. It was a truth written in fire and thunder, spelled out in the trajectories of 100,000 shells carved into the landscape of Europe by explosives that fell not as individual events but as continuous phenomena, as much a feature of the environment as rain or wind. The Americans had turned artillery into weather, had made bombardment not a tactical tool but a strategic condition, had redefined what was possible in warfare by demonstrating that if you had enough of anything, even something as simple as explosive shells, you could reshape reality itself. And for the German commanders who witnessed it, who survived it, who tried to understand what it meant, for them, that night in January, when artillery lit the sky like day, became the moment when the war's outcome stopped being a question and became a certainty. Not because they gave up, not because they lost the will to fight, but because they finally understood, with perfect clarity, that they were fighting against something larger than armies, larger than ideology, larger than national will. They were fighting against abundance itself, against an enemy that could afford to lose, against a nation that had solved the problem not by becoming perfect warriors, but by building an economic machine so powerful that perfection became unnecessary. In the end, that was what the German commanders said when American artillery lit the night like day. They said it looked like the sun rising from all directions at once. They said it sounded like the world ending. They said it felt like standing before God's judgment, weighed on scales that could not be argued with. And they said they understood then, really understood, in their bones and blood, that the war was over. Everything after was just the slow, terrible process of acknowledging what that one night had already proven. The shells kept falling. The night kept turning to day. And Germany kept losing, one bombardment at a time, one ridge and crossroads and village at a time, buried under the industrial output of a nation that could afford to turn warfare into manufacturing and soldiers into consumers of unlimited material. The Germans had fought with what they had. The Americans had fought with what they could afford to waste. And in that difference, in that gap between scarcity and abundance, lay the entire meaning of the war's final year. What German commanders said when American artillery lit the night like day was this: we cannot win. We can only endure. And even endurance has limits, measured not in courage but in shells, in the mathematical certainty that eventually, inevitably, the bombardment will find you, will bury you, will erase you from the earth as if you had never existed. Because that is what abundance does to scarcity. That is what industrial power does to fighting spirit. That is what America did to Germany, one artillery barrage at a time, until the lights went out for good.